Good morning. As we begin the final chapter of Genesis, we see the theme of showing honor as Joseph and his family bury their father Jacob, who is obviously a giant of our faith. And understandably, Joseph weeps here. He mourns his father's death. You know, Jacob was 147 years old, and he had brought into the world the sons that would become the 12 tribes of Israel. And he wasn't perfect, but through him, God's perfect plan for salvation through Christ would continue on, just as he had promised his grandfather, Abraham, and his father, Isaac. And upon Jacob's death, the Egyptians were allowed to embalm him, the verses here say, which was their custom and not that of the Israelites. But they must have allowed this to show honor, courtesy, and respect to them during this time. And we should realize it's okay to break our own customs at certain times in order to respect those in whose context we live in or we're serving in during specific seasons of life. And I've seen this many times on the mission field in foreign countries. When we lean into what is common among the people, it does speak volumes to those we are ministering to. And so after 70 days of mourning, they begin to show honor to Jacob by fulfilling his wishes in being buried in Canaan. And Abraham had purchased the cave in the field of Machpelah as a burial place for his wife Sarah way back in chapter 23. This is where his family was to be buried. So Jacob was laid to rest there with his grandfather and his father. And it's an incredible picture of just leaning into and having faith and what God had promised. They knew their future descendants would be buried there as God had promised them the land there to be given to their descendants. And they just lived it. They just walked that path as if it was already true. And it's encouraging when we, by faith, take steps of action that align with God's desires and his will for our lives, and they align with his promises. We walk in light of those promises, even when we don't see that they're quite true yet. In a show of honor as well, we see that Pharaoh's officials come along for the burial, dignitaries of both Pharaoh and of Egypt, chariots and horsemen as well. All of Joseph's family came except the children and flocks. What an amazing show of honor by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And Joseph was worthy of their honor. By God's grace, he had honored them through this time that we've been reading about, all about Joseph's life. He wielded his power and influence in Egypt in a remarkable way. It had led to their flourishing and survival during this famine, not just for them, but for other nations as well. The world benefited from Joseph's influence, from his obedience to God. There's no doubt about it. And in these verses, we see that there was much more bitter weeping and lamenting that came along with this. Right before Jacob's burial, it was loud, it was real, so much so that the Canaanites noticed and recognized the significance of what was taking place. And it is okay to mourn, even bitterly for those we lose. God understands that. But we know that all of our tears will eventually turn to joy, and our sorrow will be overcome by the hope and faith we find in our Heavenly Father. Finally, we see, as we come to the end, towards verse 14, Joseph honors his word and returns to Egypt after the burial. We read in Genesis 50:14, it says this: "After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury Jacob." And Joseph returned. He came back to honor his word to Pharaoh. But, Pharaoh allowed Joseph to go. He showed him honor. He allowed him to see through his father's wishes at the end of his life. So Joseph's life was full of respect and service to God, honoring his position and his station there in Egypt. He was able to fulfill his father's wishes as a result of fulfilling his role before Pharaoh. And when we love and serve God, we honor others and respect them. When we do all those things, it's amazing how God works out his plan to perfection. And I pray that these verses encourage you as you've heard them and as you read Genesis 50:1-14. And I pray in your heart you will regard Christ as holy today, and you will live in these truths we've discussed here over the last few minutes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.